Saturday night at the moment. We're looking at the chapter or Hall of Faith in chapter 11. It's nice just to pick up some. Oh, correctly. Is it? Oh, there we are. The main job's not in there, are they? We try and pick out some bits and pieces as we go through the book of Hebrews. But just the first 3 verses, or maybe the first 4. But we'll concentrate on the first 3 this morning. The book of Hebrews then, chapter 1, verse 1 through to verse 4. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed or made heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, as he has by an inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. It's a lovely short little reading. If I remember right, Terry Gregory preached on this on a Saturday night. We often have Terry back in the water on a Saturday evening, but he preached on Hebrews verses 1 to 2, I think it was, if I remember right. Maybe 3, and he spent the whole 3/4 of an hour, I think, on the subject. But I'm sure there's been even longer sermons and longer studies that have been done on these first 3 verses. As ever, I'll try to get it done within 20-25 minutes if I can. Yeah, that's what Sunday morning affords us, isn't it? There we are. It's okay, Anna. I'd like to speak longer. I know you want me to. But you're the side over there. Just share some words then from Hebrews chapter 1. I've taken a title from a verse that's later on in the book of Hebrews, speaking of an individual, and it ends with the word was. How great, consider how great this man was. I don't really want to consider how great he was. I want to look at how great this man is. Because we're talking of today, and we're not talking of the past, though he reaches back to the furthest point in time. And so we'll have a little look at how great this man was. The book of Hebrews, in one sense, is a very frustrating book because we don't know who's written it. Normally when we write a letter, we put our signature at the back end, but certainly in former days, they would put the signature at the front end, so you knew where the letter had come from, who's been writing, rather than, so I don't know what you're like sometimes, but sometimes if I get a typed letter, I'll go to the second page, if it is a second page, to find out who's written it. If it's writing that I recognize, I've got no need to do that, but there's no introduction, and even more oddly, there's no greeting at all. No greeting at all. The writer, whoever he is so warm to the subject that he steps in. We would say it when we were younger. He went in at the deep end. Now Paul, when he wrote to the Galatians, and he normally, there's quite a lengthy introduction, and he normally does a lengthy greeting. And as soon as he does that, he begins to unfold what the point of the letter is for. But when he writes to the Galatians, he immediately jumps in after his introduction and his greeting, and he says, I marvel that you are so soon removed from the grace or faith of him who's called you. I marvel at it. So he gets in right at the deep end. Now it's very tempting to think that this writer is also going to go in at the deep end, but he's not concerned so much with the object. The object of the book is to encourage believers not to go back. The subject of the book is Christ himself. And the writer has this thought in his mind. If I can present to them Jesus, then surely they will not go back. And we find as you go through the book that the theory, the theology, is quite lengthy. With at the end of it, almost, not at the end of each chapter, but each particular subject within the book, there's a measured exhortation then, in light of what I just told you about Jesus. Do you think you ought to be going back? Don't you ought to really think to be going forward? And as you go through the book, the theology gets shorter and the exhortations get longer. And so he really finishes from about chapter 10, right the way through, midway of chapter 10, right through to the end of chapter 13, is one complete exhortation. The theology contained in there, in the exhortation, but it's about encouraging people. It is not a book that threatens you. Not a book that threatens you. Again, it's one of those books that we ought not to be reluctant to read. It's a book that's very relevant to us. He is so warm to his subject. Like Jeremiah, he could say, there is a fire in my bones. There's a passion in my soul. The psalmist says that my tongue is the pen of a ready writer. And here this man, this woman, whoever it is that has written these pages, he is so taken up with Jesus. And so the first question we ask is this: are you so taken up with Jesus? Or is he a periphery? Is he something that comes into the equation? Something that dawns upon the horizon when other things have filtered away? This individual is so taken up, there is a burning within his soul to present to them Jesus. Now, if you find that the both Old Testament and New Testament never argue, discuss, dispute the existence of God. They take it as per. They do not try to explain the existence of God. And so, the first book in the Old Testament, in the beginning, God. No explanation as to who he is. That's for us to find out as we go along in the book of Genesis and right through to the end of the book of Revelation. Here, the writer does exactly the same principle. I'm not arguing about God, he says. I'm not disputing anything. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke unto our fathers by his servants, the prophets. And so there were various ways. There were bits and pieces that were seemingly so disjointed. And yet when you bring them together, they produce a better picture. Not the full picture, but they produce a better picture. Give a better idea of what God's plan is, of who God is, of what his plan is, and what his son is. And so we'll have different verses in the Old Testament with the prophets. We'll find out different things about God. But they are really brought together. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke to our fathers by the prophets. He spoke to them in dreams. He spoke to them in visions. He spoke to them in appearances. He spoke to them in parables. He spoke to them in proverbs. He spoke to them in song. There were so many ways that God, you could never limit him to say, this is how God's going to speak to me. We know one thing about God, he'll never contradict himself. Never contradict himself. And so by these lovely little verses that we have, we find that God spoke in various ways and in various times by the prophets. It's a wonderful little 3-verse. In our English Bible, it's in 3 verses made up of 2 sentences. In actual fact, when it was originally written, it was 1 sentence, 1 complete sentence. Again, the writer is so taken up with Christ. So he just can't stop to put a full stop in. As I've said to you, my own Mrs. Dunnett in Form 3, the juniors, would have made mincemeat of me if I'd done something like that with ands and ands and ands in it. and commas and commas and commas. For us to understand it or to break it down is to put into 2 sentences, but in the original, 1 complete sentence. It's not the longest in the New Testament, mind. That belongs to Ephesians, chapter 1, verse 15 to 23. 1 complete sentence. Paul there in that book is so taken up with this subject, he cannot stop. And so this writer is in this same type of temperament, same spirit. What was given then, in bits and pieces, which when added together, produced a better picture. God has spoken to us in these last days by his Son. Not a servant, but a son. It's not a better picture. We get the full picture. Not a better picture, not an improved picture, but the full picture. And so we find concerning Jesus that he spoke to us. We see how, when we look back in the Old Testament and bring it forward to the New, we understand how great this man is. When there was a debate between Moses' brother and sister and Moses himself, the Lord intervened. He cut in on the argument. He got involved. And he said, now listen, if there is a prophet among you, I will speak to him in vision or in dream. But not so with my servant Moses. I will speak to him face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. And so we find with Moses that he is elevated above the prophets. For with him, he was spoken to face to face. The writer in Hebrews in chapter 3 says, now consider the apostle and high priest of our calling, Jesus Christ, who was counted more worthy of honor than Moses. He's counted more worthy of honor than Moses. So we have Moses esteemed very highly, but we find that concerning Christ that he's esteemed higher. We find that Abraham, the father of our faith, and yet we read concerning Jesus, he speaks in these terms: before Abraham was, I am. And so we find that Jesus speaks and gives a fuller picture. In fact, he gives the full picture. John, writing in the Gospel, says, no man has seen God at any time. But Jesus, he has declared him. That word declared is a lovely little word. For those that like to study English, it's this word, exegete. It means to make known by teaching. Remember what the guards in the temple said of Jesus? We've never heard a man speak like this man. We've never heard a man speak like this man before. And so when God has spoken to us today, he has spoken to us by his Son to give the full picture. Then he goes on to say in verse 2, whom God has appointed or has made head of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. Notice this man. We get the impression that he's come after the prophets. And indeed, when he came to the earth, he did come after the prophets. But notice what it says here. He is there at the end, and he's there at the beginning. He spans whole of time. The writer, like Isaiah does very often, he talks about the good news. He says concerning the sufferings of Christ that he will be exalted. He will be extolled and very high. And then he goes on to say of the sufferings of Christ. So as to protect the reader to say, now look, what I'm going to tell you is going to look bad. But remember this at the very outset, he will be extolled. He might go through a bad patch. He might suffer the worst, but he will be exalted. Here, the writer
produces the same type of thought. Listen now, he says. He has been made head of all things. Everything belongs to him. Yes. That pound in your pocket, you feel him by there, Peter? No, I want you to that pound in your pocket, it's his. Jack, that book, it's his. This world is his. That one song, isn't it? This world is not my own. I'm just a passing through. It belongs to him. He's the head, the inheritor of all things. And that comes at the end. But then a strange thing there. If he's a man, listen to what the writer says. By whom also? He was at the beginning. He made the worlds. We sing that song, don't we? What kind of man is this? That can be there at the beginning, and he's there at the end. Paul, writing to the Colossians, says these lovely little words. All things were made by him and for him. You were made for him. Freddie and the Dreamers, about 1964, had this number one hit. You were made for me. But you were made for him. He will inherit all things, and he has created all things. He spans time. He spans time. He was there at the beginning, and he will be there at the end. And then it goes on to say this, to explain now more of his person. To explain that. And he says, who being the brightness of his glory? Now, I've heard some people say that that means he's the reflection of God. No more than that. You see, the moon, the light that we see, or the light that comes from the moon, is a light that's reflected from the sun. That is reflection. But with the sun, it's not a reflection. It's a big word, irradiation. As the sunshine comes from its source, the sun, so the Son of God is the brightness of his glory. God shines because he's so lovely. When we go down to Cardiff Castle along that front wall, I've always said Cardiff Castle was just made for Jeux Sans Frontières. It's a knockout. I remember when we went down there to watch it, it's a folly. They won't admit that, but it is. It wasn't built for that, but that's what I always say. Who being the brightness of his glory, who being the shining of his beauty. God shines because he is so holy, so beautiful. If you go across the front of Cardiff Castle, you'll have what they call those gargoyles, those distorted faces. And very often when we come across different cults and religions, they have a picture of God of distorted features. And that's because that's their perception of God. But here we have Jesus, the brightness of his glory. Jesus shone because he was so holy, so lovely, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. We've talked about it. I mentioned the other day, some of you will remember this now from when you used to get your pension. Remember the stamp that went on there? He bears the stamp of God. That's what it means. He bears this. What's on that stamp there will be taken from there onto your pension book. And it will give you the date that it's been given and submitted. It will surely replicate what's on there. And Jesus is the stamp of God. The word that they use is icon. Where we find with, in Greek Orthodoxy, you don't find so much statues. You'll find paintings, murals. And they show what they believe, what God is like. The icon of God. Now this helps us to understand when the psalmist said, him being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. Listen to what the psalmist says now, because he understands the source. That's the important factor. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth his handiwork. Imagine being on Penyrheol Mountain back before anything was built. Can you imagine how wonderful the view must have been? Where you would have had clear view of the Rumney River coming down through the end of the valley into the basin of Penyrheol. It would have been green, it would have been so perfect. Paul and Anita would have just come back from Austria. They would have seen sights that would have perhaps impressed them. Some would say, taken your breath away at some of the beauty that is seen. If you take Martin Rees up into Brecon, he's in another world. He sees things that I don't see. He appreciates, he understands the beauty of it all, the awesomeness of it all. And the psalmist said, listen now, the heavens declare what God is really like. He's interested in diversity. He's interested in awesomeness. He's interested in sheer beauty. Why? Because he's awesome. Why? Because he's beautiful. And so the heavens declare the glory of God. And the firmament shows forth its handiwork. Let's have a little look. Well, before we have a little look, I'll quote the other part of the verse. Not only was he there at the beginning, and he's there at the end. Not only he is so glorious, he is here now. Because we read at the end of verse 3, he is upholding all things by the word of his power. He created laws in physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics. He created those laws. And men today have the privilege of exploring those laws. But he's created them. And when you think of us spinning around the world, spinning, and yet not once do we feel pushed to the side like that. The laws he's created to defy logic in one sense. We were in the swimming pool down in the bay yesterday, and there's a whole load of water comes out of this one canal area in the swimming pool, and we tried to swim underneath it, and every time, even with me, it pushed you to the side. So by the time you come out, where the water is rushing down from this torrent, it pushes you to the side. He upholds all things by the word of his power. The Colossian writer, as he puts it, in him all things consist. All things are held together. I don't know about you, but Judith accuses me that I can't do two things at once. That might well be the case. I can't do two things at once. He upholds all things by the word of his power. He was there, he created it in the beginning, he will receive it at the end, and in between, he's holding everything together. Everything together. How great is our God? Name above all names, worthy of all praise. This is what the Colossian writer says. Lovely, lovely phraseology he uses here. Listen to him now. He is the image the icon of the invisible God. No one's ever seen him before. Angels have never seen him. Did you know that? It says concerning Christ that he was made flesh, seen of angels. They never saw him before. It's the first time they've seen him. You think they've got X-ray eyes that they can see? That's the first time they laid their eyes upon him. Who being the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions, principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things are held together. Remember we watched that DVD, Louis Giglio. I wouldn't like that as a surname. Louis Giglio. And he talked about the greatness of God. Remember he showed those stars, you know, the stars. And he gave the Latin name for the one. And it means this one star, the big dog. So if you know Latin for that, then you know what it is. Canis, whatever it is. And in there, he talked about the greatness of God, didn't he? And then at the end, he told of a time when a doctor of science told him about that one part of the body, I forget the name of it now, that holds things together. This world, he's got the whole world in his hands. And he's got you and me in his hands. What? We were watching yesterday, Crocodiles, Deadly 60. And how that mother crocodile can hold an egg in its mouth, and yet it's got the strongest bite in the known world of the animal kingdom. Yet it can hold an egg or a youngster that has just been born. He's got the whole world in his hands. And he's got you and me in his hands. So we found out how great this man is. What he's done, what he's doing, what he's going to do. But the writer, before he closes, says there's some other things that he did as well. Quite busy, the Lord Jesus, didn't he? Quite busy. When he rose from the dead, he was so busy, meeting Tom, Dick and Harry here, there and everywhere. So busy through that day. He's busy today. But he says, when he had purged our sins, the great Creator became my Saviour. When he had cleansed our sins, when he... Saviour through the cross. When he had purged our sins, cleansed our sins through the cross, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. He leaves the cross and the Saviour to becomes the Lord with the crown. Amen. You say, well, what is he doing now at this moment? Well, two things. Two things he's doing. He's waiting for his day. That's what the writer says later on. He says, sat down waiting till his enemies be made his footstool. He is waiting for that day when all things shall be his. What is he doing for our day? The writer tells us he is praying for us for our day. Yeah. With a crown on his head, he is waiting. With a crown on his head, he is interceding. For his day, waiting. For our day, praying. Consider how great this man is. He goes in at the deep end. One of the lovely things with Paul is that when he writes his letters, he uses this phraseology: I thank God upon every remembrance of you. He's not there to slam into it at every outset and every opportunity. No, I thank God, he says, making request with joy, unceasingly, for you. Here the writer, he just says, let me just tell you about Jesus. If you understand him, if you know him, then everything fits into place. And you will drop those thoughts in your heart of going back. Because Jesus is all about going forward and taking us for that end day. Well,